I want to talk about one of the most important aspects of the LSAT, if not the most important aspect of the LSAT. How important? If you understand this, then you will understand exactly what to expect on the LSAT and exactly how to approach the LSAT to get a high score. What is that one thing? The law school admissions test is not a test. Now I know what you're thinking. Of course it's a test. It says it's a test in the name. You take it as a law school admissions test to get into law school. Of course it's a test. Even the LSAC website says it's a test. And all of that is true. But it's not a test. So I have your attention, right? So what is it if it's not a test? I'll tell you what it is. The LSAT is an instrument. It is a predictive instrument that the LSAC says, in conjunction with GPA, will be a good predictor of how a student's going to perform in their first year of law school. This is not a test of your reasoning. This is not a test of what the qualities are that you should have to be a lawyer. This is not a test of the kind of lawyer you're going to be in law school. This is not a test at all. This is a predictive instrument. It is used for law schools to make a prediction in conjunction with your GPA about whether or not you can handle your first year of law school and therefore law school as a whole. I mean, after all, why do we really take the LSAT? Why is it such a big part of the admissions process? And why do law schools make such a big deal about a test when they're considering who to admit? Because they're convinced that the test works. Not as a measure of your reasoning performance, but as a measure of its predictability on how you're going to perform in law school. If law schools didn't think it worked, if they didn't think that it was a good predictor, or if it hadn't been demonstrated through data that the LSAT is a good predictor of success in law school, it would not be part of the admissions process. Okay, so why does this matter? Simple. A test measures performance. And more importantly, a test measures performance at a certain period of time on a certain day for a certain amount of information. But an instrument predicts performance. And predictive instruments have very different rules than tests. If you go into the LSAT thinking that you're taking a test, you're not going to be prepared for that LSAT, for the uniqueness of its structure, for the ways that it's different, because it has to be different to be a valuable predictor. So if you want to do well on the LSAT and you treat it like a test, you're not going to get the score you want. You are not going to get the score that you need. But if you're going to make use of this really simple but very powerful piece of information, you have to understand what it means. When we talk about a predictive instrument, that predictive instrument is going to have two features. It will possess reliability and it will possess validity. Reliability means that the instrument is consistent over time. That means that the instrument is going to function as a good predictor at the beginning as well as at the end. And that's why you can practice with older LSATs, because the LSAT hasn't changed in its ability to predict performance. It hasn't changed in its ability to be a good predictor. So you can take an LSAT from the 90s, you can take an LSAT from the aughts or the aught 10s, and you're going to know that there's a consistency across time for that LSAT, because it can't change very much over time without changing its capacity as a predictor and skewing data. Yes, there have been changes to the LSAT, and I will talk about many of those throughout this course. But what doesn't change is what the data shows about its predictability and reliability. So reliability means that the test is consistent over time. How does that impact you? Because the LSAT is not just consistent over time, it's also consistent across test takers, and it has to be. Remember, if the goal is prediction here, it can't matter where you went to college, whether it was a community college, whether it was a public 4-year, whether it was an Ivy League school. Where you went to college is going to not make a difference in terms of the ability of this test to predict your performance. Because if it did make a difference, then where you went to college might be a better predictor than the LSAT for how you might do in law school. So the LSAT has to apply in some sense consistently no matter where you went to school, and it also has to apply consistently no matter what you studied. In other words, the major you chose should not give you a distinct advantage on the LSAT. Now, certain majors outperform others on the LSAT. Philosophy is one of the top performing majors on the LSAT. But philosophy does that because of the skills it offers, not because the LSAT is skewed towards philosophy majors. Whatever your major, whatever your course of study, and whatever your university, you should perform the same on the test as anyone else. The test can't favor students in one way or another. And in fact, that's behind some of the push to connect the LSAT to the GRE or substitute the LSAT for the GRE, or there are discussions about the adequate consistency of these tests and whether they're interchangeable, whether one is better than another, whether students are, in spite of best efforts, harmed by a certain test because it carries implicit biases. But all of those discussions revolve around the same idea. No matter who takes the test, if they've completed a 4-year course of study in any course of study at any university, they're going to be prepared to take this test to the same degree as anyone else. That's why reliability matters, because it means that the LSAT is only going to test you on things that you are likely to have learned in a 4-year course of study, no matter what that course of study is or where you went to school. And that means that the skills that you will be tested on are going to be drastically limited. There's not going to be specialized knowledge on this test. There's not going to be knowledge that you could have only gotten from a particular major. There's going to be general skills that anybody should have probably picked up in a 4-year course of study at a university. Understanding that helps you understand the scope of the LSAT. If you think you have to master logic, if you think you have to master critical reasoning, if you think that you have to read at a graduate level, you misunderstand reliability. Reliability says for any test taker, the test should work the same. You should be equally as prepared. Same starting line as anybody else. You shouldn't have an advantage because of where you went to school or what you studied. And the LSAT works hard to make sure that's the case. But it also means the skills you're going to learn are relatively narrow. Also, as a predictive instrument, the LSAT is valid. Now, this is not logical validity, where we're talking about truth-preserving functions. No. Validity in an instrument that predicts performance means it in fact predicts what it says it predicts. Schools that are sufficiently convinced of the validity of the LSAT use it in admissions. I mean, look, if I could know with pretty good accuracy who's going to do well in my law school and who's not going to do well in my law school based on their GPA and their performance on this test, I'm going to use the hell out of that test, because if it is valid, if it does predict what it says it predicts, and it predicts it reliably with consistency over time and consistency over test takers, you betcha I'm going to use that test. Now, why is that important for you, the test taker? Why does validity impact you? Well, this is where you really get the keys to the kingdom. Because, see, validity is all about measurement. It's all about being able to provide an accurate measure to assess whether or not this instrument is doing what it ought to be doing, which is to say, predict your performance in your first year of law school. So it comes down to the measurement. And measurement has to be exact. Measurement doesn't like ambiguity, because what I need for measurement is precision. Look, if I say it's going to rain later, and someone says, well, how do you know that? And I say, because there are dark clouds in the sky. And they respond, well, there are plenty of times where there are dark clouds and it doesn't rain, right? And I say, well, yeah. And there are plenty of times where there are dark clouds and it does rain, right? Oh, yeah. Well, so if you're using the presence or absence of dark clouds to predict rain, it's not very precise. It's not going to do a very good job because there's a lot of ambiguity in there. Well, what do we mean by a dark cloud? Do we mean a cloud that's slightly gray? Do we mean a cloud that has shadow? Like, there are all of these questions we have to answer to establish measurement in order to assess the predictability of whether dark clouds somehow say that it's likely to rain. As it stands, the predictive value of dark clouds for assessing rain is going to be 0, right? So what I want in my prediction is to have measurable data points that are unchanging and non-ambiguous. There's just one problem. Most of the LSAT tests you on things that are highly flexible and highly ambiguous. Reasoning in the real world, reasoning out in the wild, is not exact. There's a lot of ambiguity because we have to figure out what people are saying. We have to figure out how they mean it. We have to figure out the logical implications of what they're saying. We need to understand the larger context. I mean, look, if I were to ask you, okay, provide me with reasons why we're not living in a simulation, we're going to have a lively debate. We're going to have a good discussion. But a lot of that discussion is going to involve clarifying terms, establishing measurements, talking about what the impact of various parts of evidence mean. And all of that's highly amorphous and highly ambiguous, which are things the LSAT cannot be, because it has to be valid and it has to be able to measure specific data in order to reach its predictive power. If the instrument is valid, it's not going to have ambiguity in it. And that's why I say this is not a test of reasoning, because a test of reasoning involves a lot of ambiguity. I've been teaching critical reasoning for 15 years. I've been designing tests for concepts in critical reasoning for 15 years, and I still get it wrong. I still allow ambiguity in my questions so that a student will come to me and say, well, I think that this statement could also be reflective of this fallacy and not this fallacy. And sometimes they're right, because as much as I try, as long as I've done this, reasoning's ambiguous. That's how life works. And if I want to prepare my students for reasoning in the real world, that ambiguity is going to be part of it. However, the LSAT's not testing you on your reasoning. The LSAT is predicting your performance in law school. And to do that, it has to sacrifice ambiguity. So this is not a test of reasoning. This is a different kind of thing. Yes, you need to understand reasoning. Yes, I will encourage you to learn good practices of critical thinking. But that has to be connected with understanding how thoroughly the LSAT abhors ambiguity. But see, that also helps you. Because this is not an ambiguous test, there is always exactly one right answer. And when I say that, what I mean is it's an answer that is right and always right. It's not debatable. It's not arguable. It's not something you could reasonably go to the LSAT and say, yeah, I know the answer says A, but I think it's rather D, and here are my reasons. Because if that were possible on the LSAT, its predictive value is broken. It is no longer good at predicting outcomes. The right answer is always right. It is one right answer. There are no halfway answers. There are no maybe answers. And while there are occasional mistakes, there are no ambiguities. That also applies to the wrong answers. There are 4 wrong answers. They are demonstrably wrong. They are completely wrong. They are not halfway wrong. They are not on the way to a right answer. And the LSAT, as much as they disguise it, as much as they cover it over, as much smoke and mirrors as exist on the LSAT, they can't avoid that basic element of any valid predictive instrument. There has to be one unambiguously right answer. There has to be 4 unambiguously wrong answers. They will try to mask that, cover that, not allow you to see that, but it's still true. Now, I don't mean simply that there's a right answer and 4 wrong answers. Of course there is. I mean there is an unambiguously right answer. There are 4 unambiguously wrong answers, because there has to be. And if you understand that there's no ambiguity on the LSAT at all, you've got a better chance of identifying those answers. It also means, and this is, I guess, the one bit of heterodoxy that comes out of this, if you're debating why an answer is right, or if you're debating why an answer is wrong, you don't understand the question, and you don't understand the answers. I'm not criticizing, I'm not challenging. What I'm saying is, based on the fact that this is a predictive instrument and the lack of ambiguity in that instrument, and because these are not really test questions, they're data points, if you're confused about why a right answer is right, or a wrong answer is wrong, there's something you've missed. Because the LSAT's not confused about this. Because they have to restrict reasoning to unambiguous answers. There's no flexibility here. Now, you might be thinking, well, wait, wouldn't that make the LSAT easier? After all, if reasoning in the wild is complicated and ambiguous and amorphous, then the fact that the LSAT restricts its reasoning to highly unambiguous, clear and distinct right and wrong answers, well, shouldn't that make it easier? And the short answer is yes, it should. So wait, why isn't it? Why doesn't it get any easier for you? Why doesn't it get any easier over time when we look at different cohorts of students who take the LSAT? Because validity. Here's the thing. The LSAT is drowning in data, drowning in it. And it's all data about you. The LSAT knows more about how you're going to take that test than you do. They know how you're going to study for it. They know how you're going to prepare for it. And they know what types of answers you're going to be attracted to and what types of answers you're not. They know the kind of thinking you'll engage in and how to fool you about that thinking. And I don't mean that the LSAT is some kind of diabolical entity. I mean they have massive amounts of data from students just like you who have already taken the test. And they use that data to craft their items on the test. They use that data to preserve its reliability and predictability, and they know how you're going to take this test. In a certain sense, the LSAT is kind of like Groundhog Day with regards to test takers. When you sit down at the test, it's as if you've already taken that test 100 times to the Law School Admissions Council. They have a really good idea of what you're going to do. And they use that information to distract you, to deceive you, to confuse you, to mix you up. If this were just purely a test of reasoning with this kind of limitation to non-ambiguity, yeah, it'd be very simple. But it's a predictive instrument and it needs to continue to work. And they do that by having observably accurate, measurable data points that they combine with the data they know about you to continue to make this test the same level of difficulty that it always is. And I suppose there's some bad news in that for you, right? And the bad news is this. The LSAC only makes money if their test stays valid, right? The moment their test stops being a valid predictor of performance or stops being a reliable predictor of performance, it's no good. And you know for certain, right, that the LSAC is not going to shoot their cash cow in the head by giving students the keys to the kingdom and telling them how to ace the test. Because the moment that that performance curve is skewed, test is broken. So a lot of the changes that you've seen on the LSAT over time are changes to address its predictability and reliability in response to the way that students are preparing, in response to the ways that the students are catching hold of certain elements of the test. So what that means for you is you have to be conscientious and deliberate in how you study and how you choose the resources with which you study. The LSAT's done a wonderful thing. They've put out a Khan Academy, right? And that's a prep course, a free prep course for you to take to prepare for the LSAT. And that's great. Is that going to help you get a really high score? Think about the reliability and predictability. Has to be reliable, has to be predictable. And if they want their test to continue to work for law schools, it has to continue to be predictable and reliable. So do you think they're going to give you a prep course that's going to help you ace this test that is built upon a certain performance curve? You can decide the answer to that. I know what I think my answer to that would be. So you have to be very deliberate in how you choose to study. And you can find articles about the LSAT's own data on how people study and how that affects their performance. So if you want to know, is this study method effective? Is using these books effective? Is this combination of resources effective? Well, the LSAT already has data on that, and it's accessible data, and there have been news reports on that data. So feel free to take a look at what the LSAT has to say about how people prepare for their test and the effect it has on their performance. So let's summarize what we know. We know that the LSAT is an instrument, not a test. We know that the LSAT uses only basic reasoning and basic skills. And what I mean by basic is anything you would have acquired in a 4-year course of study at a university. We know that the LSAT, insofar as it's valid, abhors ambiguity. It is a measurable data point test, meaning that the right answer is always unambiguously right. The wrong answer is always unambiguously wrong. We know that the LSAT knows us better than we know ourselves when it comes to taking this test, and they use that data to make the test difficult. And we know that tips, tricks, strategies, courses, prep, all of that has limited value when it comes to the LSAT because there are no silver bullets that break the predictability of the test. The LSAT's not going to allow that. And those are the things that we know just from the test being an instrument and not a test. And I want you to keep that in mind, and I will remind you of that as you work through these lectures and videos, especially when we get to the logical reasoning portion. You will begin to see how powerful that insistence on non-ambiguity is in being able to identify the right answer on these test items. All right, so that's it. That's the most important thing you can know about the LSAT.